How's it, my friends? This is Gordon from Keto Model Works, and today we're going to continue with this Tamiya He-219. So if you want to see me struggling with a paint pen again, we're going to do some airbrushing to make the exhaust pipes look like they're rusted. Every time I say exhaust pipe, I mean flame dampers, and vice versa. So first off, we're going to prime this kit, and my preferred primer is Mr. Surfacer 1500, as you guys have seen before in other videos, and then mix it up with some Mr. Leveling Thinner, and usually this ratio is about a 80 to 20% ratio, 80% thinner and 20% primer. Get the old paint mule out and test the primer to see if it's going on the way that you would like it to go on, which should be very thin layers of primer that you systematically build up. That'll be quite obvious in the next couple of minutes of this video, so I concentrated on this once again because I saw there's some people that's always got some kind of an issue with primer. The idea is that it needs to go on very thin, and you rather build up the layers than just blast out a huge amount of primer all at once. Not a good idea. So it's never a good idea to have your model parts blowing around like mine is doing here. It's much better to get it fixed to something. So yeah, don't do what I'm doing here, because you never know where that part might end up. So once again, paint or primer to thinner ratio is 80% thinner and 20% primer. I'm using around 12 to 15 psi on the airbrush, and that is a 0.2 millimeter needle in the Greg's airbrush. So because we're gonna use the acrylic paint pen later on to do the Wellenmuster or vermicelli or spaghetti, whatever you want to call it, camouflage, I wanted to use purely acrylic paint from the beginning. So I tried out the MRP range of acrylic paints. It's an awesome paint. It went on really well, really smooth. Mix ratio was once again about 70% thinner, 30% paint. It's going through the Harder and Steenbeck airbrush at about 12 psi. Note how you can actually see the paint dry in these accelerated clips. So let's get into some paint pen fun, not more like paint pen pain, like Arnie Schwarzenegger said, no pain, no gain. Well, we got the pain and eventually we got the gain. So, okay, let's move on, stop talking nonsense. The first mixture here is about a 40% to 60% ratio, 40% paint and 60% thinner. This is the MRP late war RLM 76 that I'm using. And I'm not a master at using these pens, although it looks like I'm the one that discovered this method. I'm not a master at using the method yet. So I can't just mix up paints and la da da, just works. Unfortunately, it takes a little bit of practice and a little bit of patience to get the paint flow correct on these pens. And guess what? I'm going to take you guys along for the ride of pain before we see the gain. So initially I had the very fine tip installed on this pen, which, well, to say the least, it did not like the paint. The flow, it would initially flow quite well, and then it would just dry up, and I tried different combinations of thinner and paint, and with the same results. So I'm not sure if it's the paint or the tip or the limitation somewhere in between. But with the 0.2 tip, it really did not work too well. So I installed the 0.4mm tip, which is the one I usually work with, the default one that you'll get with the pen when you buy one off of Amazon. And kind of had the same problem, believe it or not. So I knew that there was going to be some issues with this paint and the pen. Kept on trying, eventually got the ratio to work, or I thought so, and started doing it on the wing of the Heinkel He-219. But surprise, surprise, or more pain, it didn't work. And you'll see what happens next. Okay, so what happened next? Well, I primed the wing once again with Mr. Surfacer 1500, and then after that I sprayed the MRP RLM 75 again over this wing. Then I decided, well, this MRP RLM 76 looks like it's not going to really work too well with the pen. I'm going to try a different brand of paint. AKA real colors. So another acrylic or lacquer acrylic paint. The Tamiya version of this worked just fine with the pen before. So I was going to give this paint a crack and see what happens. So let's move on, see what happens. And not sure why I'm shaking the paint like that on video. We all know how to shake paint. And there's a little sniff test. And Jesus, if you liked your grandma's mothballed clothes smell, then you will definitely like AK Paint's smell. It's terrible. I also decided to test the 3 versions of the RLM 76 on a white piece of card just to get an idea of which one to use, and I went with version 1. Version 2 was a little bit too blue, and then version 3 was a little bit too greenish yellow to my taste. Although the Uhu that's in the museum in Washington kind of looks like they used the third version of that paint color. But yet again, flow issues, as you can see, and yeah, more pain. No gain yet, just more pain. Okay, a little bit of time traveling here. After struggling with that paint pen, I stripped the whole wing of paint and then sprayed AK RLM 75, which gave me a much harder and smoother surface to work on. Not that there was a problem with the MRP, but it seems to be a bit soft, the paint, in comparison to the AK lacquer acrylic. And sometimes you really have to press quite hard with the pen to dispense the paint, which then left these little indentations on the wing that I did not like. So therefore stripped the whole wing back, started over again, this time with the same brand of paint on both colors. Eventually got the flow rate on the pen to work as well, which turned out to be about 80% thinners, 20% paint. But then I also realized that the paint is really, really thin, and that I was going to have to come back and cover the lines once again, which in effect is quite good because it gives this faded look to the camouflage where you don't cover it again, and a slightly more vibrant effect on where you do cover the line again, which in effect is basically post shading. So I post shaded the camouflage, and it gives a much more interesting effect than just doing it meticulously and then everything looks exactly the same. So there's another technique learned. So I'm just taking you guys along for the ride of no pain, no gain. Because this is about 3 nights worth of work that's condensed into a couple of seconds here. So doing this camouflage is time consuming, to say the least. So, as everyone always says, check your references, and this is probably one of the only pictures there is in existence of this specific plane that I'm building. And as one can see, it's a very intricate Wellenmuster camouflage that's been applied to this specific uhu. I attach the wing so that I can line up the Wellenmuster lines onto the fuselage, because if you don't do that, it's gonna not line up and not look very cool. So there's another tip. Line up the wings, line up the tail planes, line up the elevators, depending on how you're building your kit, and line up those lines. Also remember to try and keep the pen 90 degrees to the surface where you're applying the paint. If you don't do this, the lines will differ in size and differ in width, and that just won't look very cool. Okay, let's move on to something a bit more exciting than just a bunch of little camouflage lines. Next to be sprayed is the exhaust dampers that has this rusty look to them. First thing I sprayed was some Mr. Color gunmetal. To go on is Tamiya X6, good old orange, and I spray these just like you kind of try to keep that in the middle of those indentations on the flame dampers. This will be the lighter color rust. Once the orange has been sprayed and dried, I'm just going to dab some Vallejo Air RAL 7028 with a sponge onto a small little area around the flame damper. This is to create some tonal variation and also to recreate the chipped kind of look on some rusty areas that you will see. Next up is some more tonal variation. This time it's RLM 81, which is a darker brown than the previous one. And that, like I said, will just add some tonal variation with the chips. The next color to be sprayed is Tamiya Acrylic XF9, better known as Hull Red. The thinning ratio for this paint once again is about 80 thinners, 20% paint. So it's kind of really thin, and it's also mixed with alcohol this time, not Mr. Leveling thinner, because alcohol dries the paint nearly instantaneously. So this is the make or break part of this technique, and because the paint is nice and thin, you can build up the layers to make the effect the way that you want it to look like. I wanted mine to be quite subtle, but I mean, you can leave it right here if you want to, with some yellow spots there, or you can keep on building the colors as I'm doing here. Next up is some Tamiya Acrylic XF64 red brown, and this is a super thin version of the paint. It's about 90% alcohol with about 10% of the paint, and once again the idea here is to build the layers up till you are happy with what you have in front of you. Also, the airbrush detail here is that we're running at a very low pressure of about 8 to 10 psi, and sometimes even lower than that. And the needle is a 0.15 millimeter harder in Steenbeck airbrush. The crux to this method is literally to keep the paint. We're done with the pain, Gordon. I don't know why you just said pain. Anyway, the idea with this technique is to keep the paint as thin as possible and build up those layers up until the point where you are satisfied with what you have in front of you. Well, there we've come to the end of another exciting video, ladies and gentlemen. I would just like to thank everyone that subscribed so far to my channel and that's given some likes. I really appreciate it. It also helps the YouTube algorithm to show my videos when it comes to airbrushing techniques and camouflages, etc, etc. So I would really appreciate if you could consider subscribing to my channel. And for those that think everyone becomes a millionaire on YouTube, those days are over. We do this because we love the hobby. No one's making no more money. Anyways, I hope to see you guys soon. I hope you learned something, and in the next part 3 we will be looking at the black underside, some undercarriage, and I think gun sights. And of course, spraying the national insignias with stencils.